From a timetable perspective, how did the Ivy League reach this decision, and what were the factors that went into it in ultimately making the call today?
You know, obviously, it's been a topic that's been discussed and studied for quite some time. The announcement today came after all the Ivy League schools had made their announcements about how they were going to return to school. So the timing on it was to get through each school's announcement on the return to school in the fall, and then add the piece today about the announcement of fall sports, or sports in the fall semester, I should say.
So conveying the message to your coaches, all your student athletes, how difficult was that today?
Yeah, hard. You know, it was hard last spring. It was hard in the spring when in the middle of the season we had to stop it, and then today we had a call with the entire staff late in the afternoon. Then we had a webinar with as many we invited all student athletes, as many that could be on there. I know there were, at one point, there were more than 500 that were on, and gave that announcement. Then the release went out, and I know all the coaches were having Zoom meetings with the teams tonight. Ultimately, it's the right thing to do right now, but it doesn't make it easy, and I feel badly for the students. It's been a tough time.
What sort of measures were taken if you were able to pull this thing off? How would it have looked differently? And what was maybe a tipping point or something that ultimately said, hey, we can't do this safely?
You know, I think you look at the travel restrictions, the limited group gatherings. How do you handle social distancing? The limited number of students that are going to be on our own campuses, and I'm sure the limited number of guests that can come onto the campus. All those things were, you know, presented real barriers to playing in the fall. And then I think as we see that as numbers unfortunately are increasing in some places, I think all those things contributed to the reality that it wasn't going to be possible.
How many men's and women's teams do you have in the fall?
Well, here's the interesting thing. We have fall sports, but we also have winter and spring sports that play in the fall, that practice in the fall. But the winter sports are playing games, as you know, in what is the fall semester. So it really ends up being, you know, it will impact at least 20 programs when you take into account the fall sports and the winter sports who have games, you know, who traditionally have competed in the fall semester.
So a basketball team or a hockey team that starts in November, are they going to have to just start January 1st, or is there any chance they can play in the fall semester?
There's no date yet on when programs can then continue, but the end of our fall semester is the last day of exams, which is December 11th. So we would not be competing prior to December 11th. And as you mentioned, that's where it impacts really two-thirds of our programs.
I know there's some optimism that fall sports can be moved to the spring. Where does the league stand on that front?
We got to look at that one. We continue to, you know, a part of it I think will be, where does the league stand on it? Also, where's the NCAA on it? You know, if the NCAA were to move fall championships, and I have not heard that they would, but you know that changes how you would look at a fall sport in the spring if the actual NCAA championship was being held in the spring. But we're going to have to look to that as well. It's a challenge to host a number of events and moving pieces in the spring for fall and spring sports. But we've got to do everything we can to try to make a sports opportunity available to students. It's been really hard, and you know, like we said earlier, you know, it's really hard on the spring sport athletes. We had great wins down the stretch too. We had and back-to-back games with a men's lacrosse win over defending national champion Virginia. Then the women beat nationally ranked Virginia Tech, and then bang, we were finished. And so it really came to an abrupt end. Here in the fall, it comes to an end before it ever starts.
Right.
And so trying to figure out what opportunities would be out there are important. We do plan to practice.
Right.
Now we've got to figure out how to do that and what measures would be put in place that would be consistent with Brown's policies and Rhode Island's own state regulations. But we do want to figure out, we're going through those now so that we can practice in the fall.
Is there a timetable for when you make a decision on winter sports, because they're not far behind?
Have to. I mean, my guess is that those types of decisions are going to, well, depending on when we start playing, I think a lot of that is going to roll into where are the numbers and what do we think is what would be forecasted for the spring semester, because our spring semester and how many students return are going to be based on the numbers, and I think whether or not we can compete in the spring semester is going to be impacted by that as well.
Now, Ivy League is unique in that you guys are basically all geographically located in the same space. You can make a decision probably more quickly without more of a ripple effect. But everyone acknowledges you're the first domino. Do you anticipate other leagues following and not having fall sports?
I'm sure everybody's having these same conversations. I don't know if everyone will do what we did. I mean, I think we did. I know we did what we thought was right, and it'll be interesting to see when it happened in the spring. It was the beginning of what a number of conferences and professional sports ended up doing. So we'll see. I mean, it does for us. It as you can imagine, it's impacted our Ivy League season, but all of our non-conference games. So we,
Right.
We've had to spend tonight and then tomorrow, contacting and speaking with schools that we had games scheduled, non-conference games that we're now not going to be able to play.
So you mentioned it, URI and Bryant. Do you anticipate those schools being able to fill those vacancies, maybe with dates? Do they line up with other Ivy League teams that are also canceling non-conference games?
It's really hard, and you wonder where are maybe some of the schools and other conferences are having similar conversations. And there was a time where we wondered, would we have a really limited schedule, and might it include playing local schools more than once in a season, which we traditionally do not do. We even entertained that, and just to make sure all of the schools in Rhode Island would have an opportunity to play the maximum number of games, if it meant that you couldn't go out of the region, or if it was easier to stay in state to play those games. But at the end of the day, for the Ivy League, and we'll see how it turns out for other schools and other conferences, it just seemed like those things that you and I were talking about earlier, about travel restrictions and social distancing and the number of people that we're going to have on campus throughout the fall semester, and that the other 7 schools are going to have on their campuses in the fall semester, just made it impossible.
Last one for me. You've been in college administration athletics for a long time. Is this just continue to be the most challenging thing you've ever experienced in college athletics?
Yeah, it is, and I think for a number of reasons. But one is that there's well, we've just learned there's no end date. When it happens in the spring, and we've never been through anything like that. I never thought in March, when this occurred, that we would that it would impact the fall and possibly beyond. And so it is the hardest thing I've dealt with, and I think it's really hard on coaches, and it's hard on students. And one of the things that makes it hard is that there's no end date. If you knew that this was something that was going to happen through, pick a date, you would just figure out, okay, how do we get to that date, and then we move on. There is no end date, and so everything's an adjustment. A lot of things, as I'm sure you've seen throughout the sports world, change day to day based on new information, and then you need to react. You need to react with new information and possibly revise your plans or go in a different direction. And we've got to be prepared to do that throughout, and that's made it hard. But that's made it hard. But the hardest part, personally, is the impact it's had on the students. That's really difficult, and I feel for them, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out ways that we can get through this so that it's beneficial to them.
All right, Jack Hayes, thanks so much for joining me. Hopefully we'll see sports sooner than later on the campus of Brown University, and good luck going forward.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.